Alright, so I want to share with you 4 tips for writing guitar solos, and these are things that I've come up with just from my own experience writing many songs, many guitar solos, and also just drawing on things that I've learned from my professors at Berklee. And there's a lot of really great insights that they've had so far. So let's get into it. So the first tip that I have for you, something that I've discovered, is basically to start off really strong. So you want to start out with like a really bold kind of statement, so it draws people in from the get-go. So they're not kind of waiting to be like, oh, what's happening, you know? They're not kind of bored. They're like, you really just grab their attention right off the bat. So one way that you can do that is you can start off really aggressively, really intensely. You can play something really fast and loud, kind of like the solo from Master of Puppets. That's the first thing that comes to mind. And actually, Master of Puppets is the song that got me into metal, and specifically that guitar solo. So I'm very familiar with it. So something like that. But what I have to say is that you don't necessarily have to start really fast and crazy and intense in order to start strong, in order to grab people's attention. And it's kind of funny, it might sound funny, but the first thing that I was thinking about when I thought about this was Professor Snape from Harry Potter. Because he is like the epitome of someone who's just very quiet and mysterious, but like just his presence alone draws your attention and is just captivating. So he can just walk into a room and say nothing, and just he commands attention. So you could play something that's more quiet and subtle and mysterious for the beginning of a solo, and you can still draw people's attention really strong and really quickly that way. So I'll just give you an example of something you could do. So you can start off with like really loud, fast guitars or something like that, like really shreddy. Or you can start off like that, more subtle and like sort of mysterious and quiet. But either way you start off, make sure you start off strong. I had a lot of fun playing that, by the way. That was fun. Number 2. This is one of those things that I actually learned from one of my professors at Berklee. This was last year. It was for a guitar improvisation class. And what he was saying, it was like really interesting. I never actually heard this before. And it was just like fascinating. I've been implementing this into my solos ever since he said this. And so basically it's the idea of when you're playing a solo, it's a good idea to kind of hint at something that you played before. So like you might play something in the verse, a little melody, and then so in the guitar solo, you might do something that kind of reflects something that you did in the verse. And just kind of hint at it in the solo. It doesn't have to be like super obvious even. So I wrote a song a few years ago. It's called Against All Odds. Like the main kind of melody in the verse, the motif, I guess you could call it, it goes something like this. So that's in the verse. So in the solo, there's this one little part in the solo that goes something like this. If you caught that, then that's cool. If you didn't catch it, it's pretty understandable because it was very subtle. So basically the part that I'm referring to is the part that goes like this. So that's a direct reflection of the verse part that goes like this. So that was completely intentional. And so the idea is that when you do stuff like that, it makes the song actually sound more cohesive. The example that I gave right there, that's like a lot more subtle than some other examples that I can come up with. But basically, it doesn't really matter if it's subtle or not, because that's the kind of thing, in my opinion, where if you listen to the song and listen to it a bunch of times, and then you start to realize, oh, wait a second, then you start to catch on. You're like, oh, he did that thing there, that's why he did that. And then when people start to understand that, then they're like, oh, okay, that's cool. So he did that for a reason, and then it starts to feel like the song is more cohesive. But I actually feel like probably even on a subconscious level, you don't even necessarily need to be completely conscious of what's happening. But some part of your brain understands there's these things going on, like peripherally, and it makes it feel more cohesive, even if the listener can't necessarily put a name to it or point it out necessarily. Like, so for me, just personally, when I do stuff like that, I tend to make it more subtle, kind of like that, as opposed to like extremely obvious. Like sometimes it is cool to be obvious about it, like in certain cases, but just personally, that's what I like to do. I think it's cool just to like slip something in there. Yeah, whether you're subtle about it or you're obvious about it, just it's a really good idea to do that, to just kind of hint at something. And if you don't hint at something, it's not like a deal breaker. It's not going to make your solo bad. It's just, you know, it can make the song feel more cohesive and like glued together if you do stuff like that. Alright, I really like this tip too. This is tip number 3. This is about using contrast to basically make the solo sound more interesting and to actually keep the listener's attention better. A lot of times we have this tendency as guitarists, and we're writing a guitar solo, to feel like we need to play like fast, and then we play even faster, and then we feel like we're building up a slope like to the climax, and so on the way up the slope we're going faster and faster, and then we reach the climax and it's like extremely fast or like extremely intense. But so while that is okay and there's nothing wrong with that at all, and I love stuff like that too, you don't have to necessarily just make it go in one direction, just up and up and up. You can actually use contrast to make it more interesting. You can let the solo kind of dip down into more like quietness and then start building back up again, so it doesn't have to be just one arc. And then when you do it like that, it almost feels like you're taking the listener on more of a journey, and it's a little less predictable too, which makes it even more interesting, and it kind of keeps the listener sort of guessing, like, oh, what's he going to do next? So you can start by playing really like intensely and fast, and then you can just start kind of like falling off a little bit and play a little more softly like I was doing before. Start building up again, kind of like that. You can take a whole bunch of little dips like that. You can actually you can rest for a little bit. Imagine that. Just like stop playing notes altogether for a little bit. That's another form of contrast. You're playing notes and then you're not playing notes. Or you're playing softly at some parts and then you start playing really intensely at other parts. It's just another idea of contrast. Playing softly. Playing more aggressively. Playing fast. I almost said fastly, that's not a word. Playing faster. Playing slower. Tip number 4, the last tip. So one thing that I've realized is that I really like when solos feel like they have like a structure to it. Like it kind of almost like you can see it as a mini composition in itself, like kind of apart from the entire song. And so you can see it even like as a story with like an intro and then a middle, then like the rising action and then the climax and then the resolution. And I think that if you see it like that, kind of like a story, it can actually give your solo more of a sense of like progression. It can make it even sound more sophisticated and less like random, a little more intentional. And beyond that, I feel like when you do that, a lot of times it can help to actually hold the listener's attention more. Because it's kind of like when you read a story, you're like reading it until the very end. And so if you structure your solo in that kind of way, then the listener wants to listen until the very end. As opposed to kind of like playing whatever, and then it kind of comes across potentially as like random, and they're not really paying attention to like the structure of the solo or anything like that. Again, I'm not saying like you can't do that when you write a solo, like sometimes you can, but I am saying that when you do it this way, at least in my experience, it really can help for sure. And especially when you're just starting to write solos and you're like, I don't know what the hell to do. Looking at it in a structured kind of way can really help. So for example, just using a solo that I wrote for one of my songs called The Proud Pointer that I put out like a few months ago on my YouTube channel. And so this is how the solo starts. This could be like the intro. So that's kind of the intro. And then after that, it comes with this little thing. So I don't know if you ever heard of the term like call and response or whatever, but that first part that I played, you could see that as like a call or like a question, and then the second thing that I played is kind of like the response, or like you could see that as the answer. So I'll play it again just so you can have more of an idea of what I'm talking about. kind of like a call and response kind of thing. Now we're kind of getting into like motifs, and so that's kind of like a tiny segment of an overall melody. Kind of like the infrastructure of the overall structure, and this is what the motifs are. So the part after that goes like this. Alright, so that's kind of like another question, and then the answer would be this part that comes right after. Alright, and then the next part, I kind of see this part as like the rising action. Alright, that goes right into the climax. It goes like this. And that very last note, I consider that to be like the resolution, because it finally feels like it's done, like that has ended. So it very clearly sounds like the end of the solo, basically. So the main takeaway from that is just to basically see the guitar solo as like a mini composition within the greater composition. Alright, so if you liked what you saw, got any value out of it, then definitely subscribe and like. And I post videos every single week, and I'll see you in the next video. Have a good night, or have a good day. See ya.